God is Not a Fish Inspector by W.D. Valgardson, Part 2 of 3. While others were amazed at his condition, afraid of the changes that had taken place inside him, it was this invisible deterioration that was gradually shrinking the limits of his endurance. Even in the darkness, he could see the distant steeple of the Lutheran church and the square bulk of the old folks' home that was directly across from his house. Emma, he thought grimly, would not be satisfied until he was safely trapped in one or carried out of the other. He hated the old folks' home. He hated the 3 stories of pale yellow brick with their small, close-set windows. He hated the concrete porch with its 5 round pillars and the large white buckets of geraniums. When he saw the men poking at the flowers like a bunch of old women, he pulled his blinds. The local people who worked in the home were good to the inmates. Tenants, they called them. But there was no way a man could be a man in there. No whiskey, going to bed at 10, getting up at 8, bells for breakfast, coffee, and dinner, bells for everything. He was surprised that they didn't have bells for going to the toilet. Someone watching over you every minute of every day. It was as if, having earned the right to be an adult, you had suddenly, in some inexplicable way, lost it again. The porch was the worst part of the building, long and narrow and lined with yellow and red rocking chairs. It sat 10 feet above the ground, and the steps were so steep that even those who could get around all right were afraid to try them. Fussy had lived across from the old folks' home for 40 years, and he had seen old people, all interchangeable as time erased their identities, shuffling and bickering their way to their deaths. Now, most of those who came out to sleep in the sun and to watch the world with glittering, jealous eyes were people he had known. He would have none of it. He was not afraid of dying, but he was determined that it would be in his own home. His license had been taken from him because of his age, but he did not stop. 1 net was not 30, but it was 1. And a 1/4 mile from shore was not 5 miles, but it was a 1/4 mile. He didn't shuffle, and he didn't have to be fed or have a rubber diaper pinned around him each day. If anything, he had become more cunning, for time and again the inspectors had come and destroyed the illegal nets of other fishermen, even catching and sending them to court to be fined, but they hadn't caught him for 4 years. Every day of the fishing season, he pitted his wits against theirs and won. At times they had come close, but their searches had never turned up anything, and once, to his delight, when he was on the verge of being found with freshly caught fish on him, he hid them under a hole in the breakwater, and then sat on the edge of the boat, talked about old times, and shared the inspector's coffee. The memories still brought back a feeling of pleasure and excitement. As his mind strayed over past events, he drew the boat along the net in fits and starts, for his shoulder would not take the strain of steady pulling. Another good-sized fish hung limp as he pulled it to him, but then as he slipped the mesh from its head, it gave a violent shake and flew from his hand. Too stiff and slow to lunge for it, he could do nothing but watch the white flash of its belly before it struck the water and disappeared. He paused to knead the backs of his hands, then began again. Before he was finished, his breath roared in his ears like the lake in a storm, but there were 4 more pickerel. With a sigh that was nearly a cry of pain, he let the net drop. Immediately pulled down by the heavy rusted anchors at each end, it disappeared. People were like that, he thought. One moment they were here, then they were gone, and it was as if they had never been. Behind the town, the horizon was a pale, hard gray. The silhouette of rooftops and trees might have been cut from a child's purple construction paper. The urgent need to reach the shore before the sky became any lighter drove Fussy, for he knew that if the inspectors saw him on the water, they would catch him as easily as a child. They would take his fish and net, which he did not really mind, for there were more fish in the lake and more nets in his shed, but he couldn't afford to lose his boat. His savings were not enough to buy another. He put out the oars, only to be unable to close the fingers of his left hand. When he tried to bend his fingers around the handle, his whole arm began to tremble, unable to do anything else. He leaned forward, and pressing his fingers flat to the seat, he began to relentlessly knead them. Alternately, he prayed and cursed, trying with words to delay the sun. "A few minutes," he whispered through clenched teeth. "Just a few minutes more." But even as he watched, the horizon turned red, then yellow, and a sliver of the sun's rim rose above the houses. Unable to wait any longer, he grabbed his left hand and his right and forced his fingers around the oar, then braced himself and began to row. Instead of cutting the water cleanly, the left oar skimmed over the surface, twisting the handle in his grip. He tried again, not letting either oar go deep. The skiff moved sluggishly ahead. Once again, the balloon in his chest swelled and threatened to gag him, making his gorge rise. But he did not dare stop. Again and again, the left oar skipped across the surface so that the bow swung back and forth like a wounded and dying animal trying to shake away its pain. Behind him, the orange sun inched above the sharp angles of the roofs. When the bow slid across the sand, he dropped the oars, letting them trail in the water. He grasped the gunwale, but as he climbed out, his left leg collapsed and he slid to his knees. Cold water filled his boots and soaked the legs of his trousers. Resting his head against the boat, he breathed noisily through his mouth. He remained there until gradually his breathing eased and the pain in his chest closed like a night flower touched by daylight. When he could stand, he tied the boat to one of the black pilings that was left from a breakwater that had long since been smashed and carried away. As he collected his catch, he noticed the Green Fisheries Department truck on the dock. He'd been right. They were there. Crouching behind his boat, he waited to see if anyone was watching him. It seemed like a miracle that they had not already seen him, but he knew that they had not, for if they had, their launch would have raced out of the harbor and swept down upon him. Bending close to the sand, he limped into the deep shadow at the foot of the breakwater. They might, he knew, be waiting for him at the top of the ladder, but if they were, there was nothing he could do about it. He climbed the ladder, and hearing and seeing nothing, he rested near the top so that when he climbed into sight, he wouldn't need to sit down. No one was in the yard. The block was empty. With a sigh of relief, he crossed to the small shed where he kept his equipment and hefted the fish onto the shelf that was nailed to one wall. He filleted his catch with care, leaving none of the translucent flesh on the backbone or skin. Then, because they were pickerel, he scooped out the cheeks, which he set aside with the roe for his breakfast. As he carried the offal across the backyard in a bucket, the line of gulls that gathered every morning on the breakwater broke into flight and began to circle overhead. Swinging back the bucket, he flung the guts and heads and skin into the air, and the gulls darted down to snatch the red entrails and iridescent heads. In a thrumming of white and gray wings, those who hadn't caught anything descended to the sand to fight for what remained. Relieved at being rid of the evidence of his fishing, if anyone asked where he got the fillets, he would say he had bought them, and the other fishermen would lie for him. Fusi squatted and wiped his hands clean on the wet grass.